All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for part 7 of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion webinar series. This 8-part webinar series will feature 2 tracks. Sessions on the Tuesday tracks are aimed at building diversity, equity, and inclusion practices in your workplace and in the community, and sessions on the Thursday tracks are focused on highlighting diverse-owned businesses and entrepreneurs. This webinar series is presented by the Greater Wyoming Valley Chamber's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council and sponsored by PNC Bank. Before I introduce our presenting sponsor, I want to go over some housekeeping items. All attendees will be in listen-only mode. To be respectful of everyone's time, we have allotted time at the end for questions and answers. Feel free to ask a question at any time during the presentation by submitting them in the Q&A section or in the chat box. This event is being live streamed on Facebook. For anyone watching on Facebook, please enter your questions in the comment section and we'll ask on your behalf. Last, a recording of this session will be available on our Facebook and YouTube pages by the end of the week and will be linked on the main event page for the webinar series. Now, to get us started, I want to thank our sponsor, PNC Bank, for again sponsoring our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion webinar series. We have a quick video from PNC to show, and then we'll hear some remarks from Andy Kudasik before he introduces today's speaker.
On behalf of everyone at PNC, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. At PNC, we embrace and promote diversity and inclusion as a core element of our values and culture. We recognize that it is bigger than any single person or group, and when coupled with collaborative teams and inclusive leaders, it has far-reaching impact. Taking the time to join us today indicates that you are interested in learning more about the roles and responsibilities necessary to create more opportunities for positive understanding and change. Thank you for showing up to prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion today. Thank you also to the Greater Wyoming Valley Chamber for creating this series, and to the phenomenal presenters for sharing their time and expertise to help foster a more inclusive culture in our community. Today, I have the distinct honor of introducing our presenters. We are pleased to welcome Leon John, Dan Kimbourgh, and Jamie Kane. Leon John, the current Executive Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Cedar Crest College, has delivered several presentations on the issues that students of color face on college campuses, with particular focus on implicit biases, microaggressions, and campus climate. He serves as the co-chair of the Campus Climate Committee of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee of East Stroudsburg University, and is an executive committee member of the NAACP Wilkes-Barre Charter number 2306. Dan Kimbourgh is the owner and president of Park Multimedia, a content creation and management company. When not handling projects with Park, he also serves on various boards and councils, helping build up and make a better community, including the American Cancer Society of New York and Pennsylvania region, Big Brothers Big Sisters of Northeastern Pennsylvania, and the Greater Wyoming Valley Chamber of Commerce. Jamie Kane is the Associate Director Development for the American Cancer Society in Pennsylvania and New York. And Jamie has a passion for diversity and equity and inclusion and has served as an organizational trainer on the topic. Recently, the American Cancer Society has instituted a cross-state community engagement task force to build partnerships with diverse communities and work to address health inequities. Without further ado, again, it is with great pleasure I get to introduce today Leon John, Dan Kimbourgh, and Jamie Kane.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that introduction. And thank you again to the Greater Wyoming Valley Chamber for hosting this event, and also to PNC as our sponsor. And thank you to Jamie and Dan for co-presenting. And thank you to all of you for taking your lunch hour and speaking about this very important topic, implicit bias in the workplace and in our community. Right? So we'll just get started because we have a lot of information to cover in a very short period of time. So why are we here today? We are all representative of the public and private sector in the Wyoming Valley. We all live or we all work in the Wyoming Valley, and as a result, we are aware of our surroundings and the people around us. We know who are part of our in-groups, but there are also people that come from various areas that live and work in the Wyoming Valley as well. So by the end of today's presentation, we will learn a little bit about how to be more aware of our surroundings and how we react to individuals who may not specifically look or sound like us. Today, we're going to speak about the definitions and characteristics of microaggressions, implicit biases, and stereotypes as much as we can. In an hour, we can spend hours speaking about each and every one of these topics. But again, we're just going to just go over a couple of the definitions with some examples. Today, we're also going to work toward an understanding that the role that implicit bias plays in our interactions, judgments, and decision-making within the workforce in Northeastern Pennsylvania and with community members. So remember I said, even though we live here, we may be from here, we work here, there are several people or many people that come from all over that settle in Northeastern Pennsylvania, again, that may not look or sound like us, right? So our population is changing. Today, we're also going to clearly define the recognition of bias and accountability for our actions and understand implicit bias's role in reaching our overall DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. Jamie, next slide, please.
Ryan, hold on one second.
No problem. Gotta love technology. We could do it this way. Okay, thank you. So the first thing we're going to speak about is implicit bias, right? So what is an implicit bias? Well, by definition, implicit bias is an attitude and stereotype that affect our actions, understanding, and decisions in an unconscious manner. So I'd like us to pay attention to that one piece, unconscious. Recently in the news, in the media, and conversations that we have with our colleagues and our friends, and in our own social circles, we may have heard the term implicit bias only because of the fact of so many incidences that has been occurring in our world in the past 1 or 2 or 3 years. Implicit bias has always been around, right? But we're only now really hearing about it. So as it relates to race, implicit bias means that you're having preference to one race over the other, right? It occurs because our brain looks for patterns and associations with one group over another. Now, what that means is you're not specifically feeling that. You don't think you feel that way. It's unconscious. So between the ages of 5 and 12, our brains are pretty much being formed to encounter people who look like us and who we're surrounding ourselves with, and we associate ourselves with these individuals. That is part of our in-group. So by the time you're 12, you've formulated your own implicit biases. By the time you're 12, you're surrounding yourself with people who look like you, who are influencing you, and people who you associate yourself with. So automatically, if you see someone that does not look like you, your brain automatically tells you that that individual is not part of your in-group. So that's where most implicit biases come from. Implicit biases doesn't just have to do about race, though. In our area that is predominantly white, again, we have so many populations that are moving to this area. If we have grown up in an area that is predominantly white and we see someone that is not white, our brain is telling us that that person does not look like us, so they may not belong to our in-group, right? So that's not your fault. Implicit biases are pervasive, meaning that everybody has them, right? So even if you try not to be biased towards a certain individual, you may have implicit biases towards them. Now, like I said, it doesn't necessarily have to be about race. The one thing I like to use, especially when talks about people from Northeastern Pennsylvania, is pizza. I'm not originally from this area. I'm from New York, but I grew up in the Caribbean, but I'm from New York. So to me, pizza is a round pizza pie with slices, right? When I moved to Northeastern Pennsylvania, I was introduced to Old Forge pizza, which, don't get me wrong, I think is great, but I don't think that that's pizza. I'll eat it, I like it, but I have an implicit, I've had an implicit bias towards Old Forge pizza. The other example I could think about and that we could probably relate to are drivers in metropolitan areas, right? So think about if you're driving outside of the area, or if you're going to like, and I'm using these cities, New York City, Philadelphia, or even to New Jersey. How do you feel about driving in some of these states or areas, right? You automatically may tighten up, you may become a little bit more aggressive because your brain is telling you that you may have a bias towards New Jersey drivers or New York City drivers or Philadelphia drivers, right? So implicit biases exist in almost every aspect of our life. But as it relates to race, it is having the preference of one race over the other that your brain tells you to because of the people that you surround yourself with. Now, the good thing about all this, the bright lining is that the silver lining is that it is malleable, meaning that it can be unlearned. When I say unlearned, it can be something that you reflect on. If you feel yourself having a bias towards someone, if you see them and they look different, you may become a little bit more cautious. You have to ask yourself why internally, right? Why do I feel that way? And if you ask yourself that, then you can go ahead and do research. We have the internet, we have Google, we can use some of the resources that are available to us via those means. So ask yourself why you feel that way. So that's the good thing about implicit biases is that it can be unlearned through reflection and through self-questioning. Jimmy, can I have another slide, please? Having a hard time with the PowerPoint, I see. So the other thing we're going to talk about today are stereotypes, right? So the definition of a stereotype is that it's a fixed overgeneralized belief about a particular group or class of people. That's the dictionary researched definition, right? Stereotypes are explicit. They're not implicit, but they are explicit and are the result of conscious, intentional, and controllable thoughts and beliefs. They can be positive, neutral, or negative, right? So when you think about implicit bias, which is unconscious, a stereotype is explicit by contrast. And so it is something that you act on, right? Now, it's also important to say that you can be explicitly unbiased, but still have implicit biases because of stereotypes, if that makes sense. So I'll say that again. You can be explicitly, meaning that you don't show that you have a bias, but still have implicit biases because of stereotypes. And again, that's because of the fact that you may live in an area or be from somewhere that when you see people from other areas or people that don't look like you, because of stereotypes that you may have formulated in your head or based on media or based on some other stories that you may have heard, that's where the stereotypes come from, right? So they're explicit by nature. Just because you have a person of color who's your friend does not make you not biased towards people of color. Just because you have 2 or 3 colleagues that may be from New York City or Philadelphia or Washington, D.C. or any other metropolitan area doesn't mean that you're not biased towards people from metropolitan areas, right? We can still have these colleagues and friends, but still have biases. It's not an excuse, right? You can know someone from the LGBTQ community who's out, but still have implicit biases about the transgendered population, right? Because you may not know much about it. And so your brain is telling you that those people do not belong to your in-group. When I say that stereotypes can be positive, neutral, and negative, that is correct. Now, it's positive, neutral, and negative to that individual, right? So I'll give you a couple of examples. And please, full disclosure, this is not how I feel. These are just examples that I use in these presentations, right? So a positive stereotype is that an example of that are that all African Americans can dance, right? Think about that. We may have heard that, right? Just because someone is African American, that means that they can dance. That could be the example of a positive stereotype that you hold. The example of a negative stereotype are that men are physically and mentally stronger than women, and women belong in the households. That's a negative stereotype that we may have, right? An example of a neutral stereotype could be members of the Latinx population. They're very close to their family and they all live together, right? With their parents or grandparents, right? That's not necessarily true for the entire population, for the entire African American population, the entire Latinx population, or men, or the role of men and women. That is not, research will show that all of that is not true. But these are stereotypes that we have based on the messages that we receive. Jamie, next slide, please. So we spoke about implicit biases. We spoke about stereotypes. We want to speak about microaggressions now. So what is a microaggression? So this definition of a microaggression was based off of the civil rights movement, which had occurred 10 years prior to this definition. A subtle, stunning, often automatic and nonverbal exchange, which are put downs of people of color by offenders, right? We have looked at microaggressions and expanded that to include not only exchange, nonverbal exchanges based on race, but it can also be based on socioeconomic status, a disability, the appearance of someone, their gender identity, or their sexual orientation, or any status that they may hold as an underrepresented community member. And that occurs, again, because the brain looks for patterns and associations with one group over another. Now, these subtle put downs can be, you don't have to verbalize it. It can be actions. So think about a time, and I'm not saying you, when I say you, I don't mean all of you, but you may have seen something where a person's walking down the street, a group of people are walking down the street, and then maybe like one African-American person is walking towards them, and so they cross the street and go to the other side. That's a microaggression. The example that I use for my presentations for institutions of higher education are the faculty members who call upon their students because it may be the one or two students of color in the classroom. And so if any relevant lessons come up about people of color, they single out those two individuals because they feel like they've experienced it, right? Just because you're from Philadelphia doesn't mean that you can speak to inner city Philadelphia, right? That's a microaggression. Right? Subtle put downs. We can go on about microaggressions. There's so many characteristics of it. But I know I only have like I have a few seconds left, so I'm going to turn it over to Dan, and he's going to explore a little bit more about implicit biases.
So thank you for that, Dr. John Leon. So when we talk about implicit bias and we understand what it is, right? So looking at the idea of the microaggressions and stereotypes and all these biases, we have to sort of be careful because now that you have that information, so let's say you've gone through a implicit bias training, they're very big positives, right? It can help explore hurdles within the workplace. So if you have someone who has negative implicit bias and stereotypes towards different groups that are unconscious, they don't realize they're doing it, right? So the women are always the note takers when a group gets together, or when we're doing something physical, you always select men to do certain things. Or when you look at race, let's have all the Asians do these things, right? So we can start to understand these hurdles within the workplace and misconceptions because we realize this is implicit bias. We're not doing it intentionally. It's something that's sort of happening at an unconscious level. And so once we learn that, we can train people to see it, like was said, so that we can start acting accordingly and then open up lines of dialogue. Because often if implicit bias and microaggressions are happening, that means that usually someone is being affected by it. And someone may be harboring some negative feelings. And if there's no way to communicate that, if there's no effective communication in the workplace, you'll have someone who sort of feels put down. They're experiencing these microaggressions, but there's no way of sort of working through how do we get through that. So in a workplace, exploring bias allows us to sort of see these things sort of laid out in front of us and say, this is what we need to work on. These are the specific areas within this community or workplace that we need to move forward with. But we have to also understand that examining implicit bias does not actually change people. It makes them better aware of their behaviors and patterns. And so if you have someone who has an implicit bias towards a certain group, but also carries that stereotype, you can't do implicit bias training and say, all right, we've made a change. We've done this and we've moved on. No, there's actually more work that needs to be done. Implicit bias is sort of a starting point. So you understand that there are issues, but that doesn't mean that you've changed the person, you've just made them aware of them. If they're made aware and there's nothing being done to make changes, then you have a bigger issue because you've gone from recognizing that a bias exists to maybe there needs to be some sort of actions or accountability. Because what was once considered unconscious may have actual conscious actions. And so we have to make sure that we're looking for those things. We have to also make sure that once we understand implicit bias, we're not using it as an excuse in the workplace. An action needs to happen. Something needs to change. Otherwise, we're just spinning our wheels when we talk about implicit bias and sort of how we're moving forward. So we need to make sure that there's some sort of action plan that's put in place to use these steps to move forward. Otherwise, it's really pointless to go through and do it. And then within the workplace as well, when we look at systemic issues and traditionalist issues, okay? So again, going back to the gender roles between men and women in the workplace, if you have an implicit bias and you're looking at sort of what men and women are doing, or the communities, if you work in the community where you're sitting specific individuals based on implicit bias, you're really sort of falling into this traditionalist trap. And you want to make sure that with the knowledge of implicit bias, you make changes within the workplace so that if you have someone who doesn't fit into a particular role or a stereotype, positive, negative, or neutral, that you allow that person to move and do things that are more comfortable. But also, if you have someone acting on those things, we have to make sure that there's some sort of action plan to start correcting that behavior. Because the big thing you don't want to have happen is person X in group A over here has an implicit bias towards women. And okay, well, we're going to move them out of this group and move them over here and have them work with a different group of women or a different group within the company. But there was nothing done to sort of check the implicit bias other than making it known. Well, if that same behavior starts happening again, they've moved from one group to another. Now they're doing it again. We need to make sure that there's some sort of mechanism, whether it's HR, whether it's hiring someone who is your DEI spokesperson, someone who's tracking these things to make sure that you're not just shuffling people around and avoiding the issue overall. Jamie, next slide. And so we have to realize that implicit bias is really just a diagnostic tool. It allows us to examine the workplace and see where we have faults so that we can start working forward. And an example of this is that I'm not originally from the East Coast. I'm from the Midwest, where we don't have state inspections. And when the first time I moved out to the East Coast, I had to get my car looked at in New York, and my car drove fine as far as I understood. There was no issues with it. I go to get it inspected, and they tell me that there's $4,000 worth of work that needs to be done to be legal in New York on the streets. Well, that was the diagnostic tool. What I do next is up to me. Fix the car and spend $4,000 on it, go get a new car, ignore the inspection. Whatever happens next is my decision. Therefore, I'm accountable for those actions. We have to look at implicit bias the same way. It's just a diagnostic tool to sort of check how things are going in the workplace, which also means that you're probably going to need to do this examination and looking at implicit bias on a regular basis. It's not a one and done thing. You can't check a box and go, hey, we've done some implicit bias training. Everyone sort of knows where their biases are and what to look out for. Now we're done. We're sort of done with our DEI. That's not the way it works. This is just the tool to sort of start moving forward. Next slide, Jamie. And so we have to realize that this training isn't the actual work. It's the beginning to the work. This is the blueprint you're going to use moving forward to say, within our workplace, gender is an issue, race is an issue, and LGBTQ issues are things that we need to work on. There are plenty of other things that may happen, but maybe disability isn't an issue in your workplace. Well, that's awesome. Don't spend too much time working to solve something that's not an actual problem. Keep it, in the forefront and making sure you don't slide backwards. But if you can diagnose and figure out these are the things that we need to work on in our workplace, that's awesome. But the implicit bias training and examining it isn't the actual work. It's the beginning of the work. And we also have to make sure that we remember that discrimination, once it sort of goes beyond unconscious bias, once it moves past all these other things, if someone's actively discriminating against people, it's got to be tracked. And it has to be appropriately dealt with each and every time. Because if not, as a company, you're sending a conflicting issue. You may want to move forward with DEI and make the workplace better and safer, but you're not actually holding the individuals accountable who are moving against that. And if that's the case, then none of this matters, because it really will just feel like you're trying to check a box and sort of move forward and say that we've done these things, and that's not what you want. And looking at even the research when it comes to implicit bias, this is something that takes time. There was a group that did research from 2009 to 2016, I believe, looking at implicit bias in the workplace, and they found that I think 17% of when it came to gender went from negative stereotypes to neutral, right? And so 17% over that 10-year span of time, sorry, a 6-year span of time, it took it from negative to neutral in that one area. But that was only looking at implicit bias. And so other things need to happen if we want to start moving the way we view people to neutral. And neutral is good, because you don't want to favor people and you don't want to look down on people. You want to have a neutral outlook, taking people at face value, what they have to offer the company and those things. Next slide, Jamie. And so, went too far. And so we have to really understand that this is the early step. DEI is not just implicit bias. We have to realize that this is the stepping stone that allows us to move forward within the workplace and gives us a roadmap so that we know here's what we need to be working on, and that we're going to have to come back to it. You're going to have new employees. You're going to have employees that have left. Every time you bring people into the mix, you have to start looking at what are you doing with DEI and where does it fall within the company. And so looking at what's next, I'll hand it over to Jamie.
Thanks. Trying to manage a couple of different things. So obviously Dan and Dr. John are absolute experts in this subject and have done many talks that I've heard, and hopefully you're already starting to hear and see some things to think about for your workplace or things that you could do. And really, I'm just going to spend a few minutes on the last part on some things that you can do, actionable items. When Dan, Dr. John, and I were putting this together, we wanted to really focus on action. It's not just here's some education on it, but what could you do? So what you're seeing in front of you right now is the American Cancer Society is part of the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion. So our CEO, Gary Reedy, who ironically his last day is today, he is a signer to this pledge and to this process. His successor has been named and will be coming Dr. Knudsen, who would be our first female and first cancer researcher to actually be a CEO for an organization in our history. And she will also be part of this process. But this Day of Understanding pledge is to check your bias and speak up for others and show up for all. And just looking at it really quick, checking your own biases and take meaningful action to understand and mitigate them, initiate meaningful, complex, and sometimes difficult conversations with friends and colleagues. Ask myself, do the actions and words reflect the value of inclusion? I will move outside my comfort zone to learn about the experience and perspective of others and share insights related to what I have learned. This again is an example, and it's something that you could find with the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion that you could look for your workplace to do as a pledge for senior leadership, for all workers in general, to participate in that process and really, truly starting to move from the thought process to action. And what are we going to do about it? So on that, with us, we do tie diversity, equity, inclusion to the mission of the organization. And it is a core value of our organization. Building a sustainable, inclusive organization is vital to the work that we do. And we will not achieve our mission of saving lives or remaining relevant if we don't engage all who are impacted by cancer. And we know there's great inequities and there's great disparities that we need to address to ultimately defeat cancer as a disease. That needs to happen. So it's a strategic part of what we do. And something I've heard Dan talk about often is DEI needs to be part of everything you do as an organization. It needs to be that process that you're thinking about all the time when you're doing your strategic planning, when you're doing your planning, when you're moving as an organization. It needs to be something that you're constantly thinking about. And then this is just another set of tools, powerful conversation skills, starting with listening, asking powerful questions, talking directly, being respectful, offering empathy and support, using self-reflection, and being an active observer of situations and dynamics. And you can see this here. These are, again, some tools to help guide some of this conversation for you personally or for your organization. And again, part of this is Dan and Dr. John have mentioned, is developing those internal resources that you need. As Dan mentioned, implicit bias is the first step in a process. The process needs to include a whole host of actions in a whole list of items. And as you can see, just as an example, again, looking at our organization, there's a social justice toolkit, how we could better support Black communities and specific in this issue. And then you'll see our diversity and inclusion resources that are internal for staff and external for volunteers, partners, vendors, and organizations that we work with. And you could see here, I know it's a little bit small, but there's a lot of different actions that are part of this. And that's where, Dan and Dr. John are talking about moving it from conversation to action. And then lastly, this is just a little bit about, being great allies in this process. And it's, again, listening, learning, as Dan, I think, has said, doing the work that's involved in this process, and then support. So if you think about that from an ally perspective, what can we do to better listen, to better learn, to do the work and support the cause? And you'll see one thing listed here, again, back to the organization, is instituting employee resources groups. That is an action item that you could do for your company if it makes sense to do so. So I'm going to pause there and bring back in Leon and Dan for any final thoughts or to wrap us up.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Dan. I guess, like we said, this is a conversation that needs to be continuing. It's not something that we just, we've heard about implicit biases and microaggressions and stereotypes, but there's so much more that goes along with this. There are resources that are available to all of you. And so I invite you to explore those resources. As far as implicit biases are concerned, if you have a pen and paper, I'm going to ask you to write this down. If you're curious about your own implicit biases, there's a Harvard Implicit Association test. And so all you have to do is put that into a Google Drive, and you will find the link. And I invite you to do that if you have 10 minutes of your time. And the Implicit Association test tests your implicit bias from everything from race to gender to food type to political affiliation, etc. And so there are like 5 or 6 different tests that you can take. And it's easy. You just sit there once you have 10 minutes and you click through a couple of images. And so the algorithm lets you know if you have an implicit bias towards a specific group of people. So that's a good starting point. Then I would also invite you to please do some, just plug into a search engine, best books that explore implicit biases. And there's a whole host of resources that are available to you for you to take a look at and for you to do some additional research.
And I would just add again that remember that it's always an ongoing process, and that your implicit bias are things that are unconscious, but that if you don't take the action to sort of weed through those things on a regular basis, you can always develop new biases, or they may become harmful in the long run. And so check out the Harvard tool. It's a really good one. Read up as much as you can and be willing to have difficult conversations. I think that's the one thing that the easiest way through this, and going back to that last slide, talking about listening and support, to listen is that, let someone talk to you about how they're feeling and what's going wrong, and support is how do we move forward? What are the actions that we can take? And so be always open and willing to have difficult conversations. If you do it in the right way, feelings won't get hurt and you move on and you're better off afterwards.
Yeah, that's a big one. Sorry, Jamie, I don't know if I cut you off, but listening, and then also addressing issues and having uncomfortable conversations. I mean, that's a big one. I think as human beings, we all tend to tiptoe around certain things because we try not to offend, or we try to be as politically correct as we can. But in order for us to move this work forward, we need to have uncomfortable conversations with each other. And some of that means examining ourselves and our own implicit biases or outward biases that we have, right? So like I began by saying, living in Northeastern Pennsylvania, that's predominantly white, through conversation with several people, including some extended family members, through my wife, I have been able to, speak to them about biases that they may have had and issues that may have come up, and I act as a resource for them. However, that doesn't mean that every person of color is a resource, right? This is my work. This is what I do. So the best thing to do is to just seek out resources as much as you can. I don't know if our contact information is shared with everyone, but I would invite Ben to send my contact information at least If there's anything at your specific area or job or where you are, if you have a question about it, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm pretty good at email, and I'd be willing to help as much as I can. Is there a mechanism for us to take questions? I don't know. I didn't ask that question.
There actually is. So there's a Q&A at the bottom.
Okay.
One of them was, I think, for Jamie, looking at the when is the Day of Understanding?
Yeah, so that is an annual thing we started last year as an organization. We have an annual Day of Understanding, which is a conversation for all staff to be involved. It's led by our DEI team at the organization and our CEO and leadership team, engaging staff in a conversation. The pledge is one of those things as an action step from those conversations. But again, it's included as an example of something to start a conversation. So that's something you might want to do as an organization to really look at.
Thanks for that. And then another question says, it seems that proactive actions and decisions continue to promote bias. And I would disagree. I think, so one of the tripping points when it comes to bias is this idea that if we continually talk about it, that we're promoting it in the long run. That if we talk about the role of women in the workplace, the role or how we look at men or how we look at minorities in the workplace and these things, that we're actually promoting bias because we're sort of putting it out there and opening it up to the air. And it doesn't really work that way. Like, if you stop there, if all you do is implicit bias training and that's the end goal, right? That's why we said this is a process and implicit bias is the first step. If all you do is implicit bias training, yes, you are really just sort of airing out biases and highlighting them. But the goal is to learn about the bias that exists, and then how do you move towards neutral? How do you move away from being biased towards different groups? And so if you stop at point one, you'll never get to the end goal. And so I don't think that it's actually promoting bias. It's promoting understanding bias and laying out the foundation, like I said, to move forward so you can move away from those things. I hope that answers the question.
And you helped me out a lot with that last part to the end of the job for me at the end. Anybody else have any other questions? And thank you guys too for speaking today, Leon, Jamie, and Dan.
Thank you for having us.
It was a good time.
Yeah, and one thing I just want to add, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ben.
Oh no, I was just gonna say I have one question for you all. If you are interested in starting DEI practices at your workplace, and you guys mentioned this is a great way to start with that journey, what are some of the ways that you could introduce this topic to your team?
So I can address that by suggesting that they sign up for seminars like this one. There's so many of them out there. There's so many resources out there. So this would be a good one. And I'm not saying mandating it because, when we're told to do something because it's mandatory, then we kind of push it away. But strongly suggesting that they go through this training. Writing into your policy a DEI plan, saying that, having language in there that speaks to the equity that exists in the workplace, that helps a lot too. And then long term is, specifically looking at your hiring practices and where you're recruiting individuals to come from, maybe expanding that and maybe looking at minoritized communities and looking to, do some recruiting in those areas as well. Yeah, this all sounds simple, and I just said it in the space of like 30 seconds, but this is a long-term type of commitment. So the first thing you should do is just suggest that all these resources that are available, ensure that your employees are getting some sort of training. So investing resources in some sort of training, or suggesting that they come to, seminars like this. And then the longer term one would be, changing your hiring practices and looking at areas that people of color may be from, because there are qualified individuals there. They just may not know of the availability of what's available at your company, and looking to recruit there as well. And then maintaining that conversation. So just because you come to one seminar training, it's not a one and done. It's a conversation that needs to continue happening. So if you want to offer workshops or seminars within your own workplace, seek out professionals to see, because you can find them. They're there, they're around. I can tell you that. And they would be happy to come in and do some trainings and seminars for you.
And I want to jump on the idea of the hiring practices. One of the questions is that popped up was it's not less about conversations, but more about hiring someone because of their race or gender. And I think that's what Leon was just talking about. It's not about saying, all right, there's no quotas. The idea that there's a quota that exists, there are no quotas. And so no one's saying that you need to have, when you look at your employees, well, you need to have 50%, this group, and 50% or 25% this group, and 2% this. It's expanding the net in which you're actually recruiting. And so making sure that whoever's writing the job description within your company comes from a wide swath of individuals. And so it's not one person writing a job description. It's a group writing it. But also then when you look at who's making the hiring decisions, that's a diverse group as well. Also looking at where specifically you're recruiting. And so if you just post jobs on internet websites and things of that nature, you're going to get a certain group. But if you're looking to diversify, what other areas within your community can you post that job? Can you send it to local churches that have diverse groups? Can you post it in restaurants that offer diverse fare so that it's being seen there? There are ways of casting a wider net so that you can get more diverse applicants. And the more diverse your applicants, legitimately, the better off you will be in finding someone, because you're getting more applicants applying for it. So there's the better chance that you're going to get the right employee. Now, if you do all these things and the right employee is a white male, then the right employee was a white male. But you've made the effort of widening the net so that you can find different groups. And when we look at a post-COVID world, if you work in a workplace that is no longer, you have to physically be there. If you're going to continue to work remotely, there are numerous job boards for individuals with disabilities, for persons of color, looking at women in specific. Like, there are job boards that are out there that if you want to diversify, put your job in those places. Because now if I don't have to physically show up, you may run into the fact that you can find things. But the other thing to keep in mind as well is that if you're widening the nets of where you're looking, you're going to start looking at, oh, well, maybe this person in New York City is the perfect fit. They're going to, and you want them to move to NEPA, and no offense to NEPA, but pay them. You have to be willing to understand that you're not just paying for a relocation, you're paying for an entire lifestyle change. Like, you're asking a person of color to leave a New York City or a Philadelphia or wherever and come to NEPA, where they may be one of very few. And in your workplace, they may be the only person. That is something else to look at as well. So you're not paying them because you're not hiring them because they fit whatever the description is. You're casting a net, but then also understanding the difficulty of taking on this position. And so that's my answer to that one. I don't know if either one of you want to jump in on looking at hiring as well.
I think you hit it, spot on. And the three of us have had this conversation about hiring and volunteerism and other things. And I think it goes, particularly with some of those conversations, going and looking around the room, and looking around the community, and is what you're trying to do reflect what the community looks like? And raising those voices up and bringing those voices in is so important for us to build stronger organizations and move forward. And I think that kind of starts to touch on one of the second questions I see here about how does NEPA move forward? And I would actually love to sit back and hear, Dan and Leon, engage a little bit more on that topic. But I think that's the point of it. To build stronger organizations, we need a diverse group of skill set, opinion, background, lens that they're viewing things from, and you're going to have a stronger organization at the end of the day because of it, and we're going to have a stronger community because of it. And Leon, I don't know if you want to build off of that or go into the second part about NEPA.
Yeah, no. As far as NEPA is concerned, like Dan had indicated, I mean, we're so close to other metropolitan areas that seeking out those individuals, making sure that our recruitment includes, specific areas it's a little bit easier. However, like Dan said, you have to be willing to invest resources and make sure that, you're being competitive in terms of how much you're paying your employees across the board. and especially individuals who are moving from specific areas, because like we say, just because we have an influx of people of color or any underrepresented group that comes to this area, it doesn't mean that we're diverse. there's so much more that is a piece of that, right? So being diverse is not only about hiring a number of people. You need to have support services, ensure that there's support services and mechanisms there for that individual, meaning that that's investment in the specific area itself, right? So I looking, this is a Chamber of Commerce event, so this is actually a plea to the Chamber of Commerce, ensuring that you have representation in the businesses that you represent, right? Ensuring that you attract more people from out of town to open businesses in the immediate area. So again, none of this we can't accomplish all of this overnight, but it has to start somewhere. There was another question about writing a DEI plan. That sounds like it's all dependent based on your own company. To be quite candid, I don't know if you've noticed the trend, but a lot of companies are hiring DEI professionals, right? So DEI professionals is a thing. I mean, that we have individuals who are out there that are literally doing research, and this is their train of study. So finding those individuals, getting them to your business to help you write that DEI plan, maybe as a permanent individual too, because they can help you with these workshops and seminars. Or even if you want to start at first, I mean, there are so many consulting agencies that are available that can help you write that DEI action plan for your specific company. But again, it all comes back to resources and what you have available to you. So making sure that you have those resources available and utilize resources and understand that's available. And if you don't have the resources, there are funding opportunities available as well that you could also look into through grants and other sort of funding opportunities that are available as businesses.
And I would really say the idea of the DEI professional, whether it's a consultant or it's a full-time hire, is something that I think all companies should look to. And I would always argue, you have an HR department, whether it's an individual or it's a whole department. You have an HR department that's there to sort of double check and make sure that you're not breaking the law, that things are happening in certain ways. If there are violations, you go see HR and they work through things. I think that DEI needs to be thought of in the same way, but don't put it on your HR department. Because HR is looking at specific things here. Your DEI consultant is someone who's going to be able, because of the research that they do on a regular basis, staying up on the law that when it comes to DEI and hiring practices, all these things, having someone that's sort of a clearinghouse for even little things as before you put out that next social media message, right? And given the current times that we live in, when your company wants to make a public announcement in support of something or standing up against something, have a DEI person, again, whether it's a consultant or it's in-house, who just reads it over to make sure that the message you're trying to get across is the actual one and you're not just giving lip service to something. And so it's that whole range of whether it's seminars and consistent trainings and writing your DEI plan to just making sure that the message you put out is actually inclusive and is not going to get you in trouble down the line. And so that's a real position, like Leon said, that are popping up all over the place. And if you need help writing a plan, let me know, reach out, we can sit and talk about it as well. I will always argue, look at universities. Like Leon's job is working in this area. Most universities have someone whose job it is to look at DEI and multiculturalism. So if you really can't find a consultant, they're looking online, or you want to find someone who's local, reach out to your local university. I'm more than willing to bet that whoever's there, if they have the time and the world isn't going crazy, would be willing to sit down, and work out a fee and figure out those things as well. So, but they are out there. There are options. And so just look.
And I just want to build really quickly off Dan's point, and the three of us have had this conversation too. Like, that work cannot just live as part of a smaller department. That needs the top leadership buy-in and direction and power to make the decisions necessary to make this work. Or I believe, and Dan believes and Leon believes, based on fact, it will fail if it does not have that level of engagement.
The last question we had in the chat, would you all be willing to share the PowerPoints with anybody who attended today? Awesome.
Absolutely.
Sweet. Thank you, guys. Do we have any last minute questions before we close out? Just give it a couple seconds to anybody has any last minute that they want to put in the chat box or the Q&A.
While we're waiting for that, I was just going to say, and again, the Wyoming Valley, the Greater Wyoming Valley Chamber is a great resource. The DEI Council is a great resource. You know, there are folks out there in, you know, addition to Leon and Dan who can help with this. And please reach out if you do need additional help. There is support out there.
Thanks for the shout out, Jamie. Awesome. Well, thank you, Leon, Jamie, and Dan again for speaking today. And thank you all for spending your lunch hour with us. Again, we did record this. It's going to be on our Facebook and our YouTube page. We've been doing good at uploading them within the day, but if not by the end of today, it'll be uploaded tomorrow. And we encourage you to visit our event page to register for our last session, which is this Thursday. And that's preserving and promoting ethnic-owned businesses in our region. The Greater Wyoming Valley Chamber of Commerce's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council looks at our area's diversity initiatives, ensures inclusion in chamber programs and policies, and works towards a more equitable future for all in the area. If you'd like to get involved with this, check out our council page on our website at the Get Involved tab. You can find out more about our council and what they do, as well as sign up for our news. If nobody has anything else, thank you all again for joining, and we'll see you on Thursday.